Professor publicly insults Big Shaq, but his response leaves everyone stunned. The university lecture hall is packed today. Whispers echo throughout the room as students exchange notes, check their phones, or simply chat about side topics. On the board, the title of today's lecture is already written, a discussion on modern political thought and its impact on society. Everything seems normal, just like every other political class before it. But there's something different. At the front of the class stands Professor Richard Calloway, a man with graying hair and thin glasses perched neatly on his nose. He's a seasoned scholar, known for his sharp oratory skills and his willingness to express his personal views. In the academic world, he's a respected figure, but also one surrounded by controversy. He doesn't just lecture on politics. He uses the classroom as a forum to express his biased views. For those who agree with him, it's an engaging class where they feel their beliefs are reinforced. But for those with opposing views, the lecture becomes a challenge, where differences are not only dismissed, but sometimes ridiculed. Most students in the class are used to this, but today there's something strange in the air, an invisible change that even Professor Calloway hasn't noticed. Then, as his gaze sweeps across the room, it pauses. A familiar face, but one that doesn't belong in the academic world, is sitting among the students. Shaquille O'Neal. The entire class notices it too. The whispers grow louder. Some students turn to each other and whisper, "Is that really Shaq? What's he doing here? Does anyone know?" Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, the 7 feet 1 inch tall man, a giant of the NBA, is sitting in the middle of the classroom. The chair beneath his massive frame looks oddly small. He's not a regular student. He's a star, a businessman, a cultural icon, someone who could easily be at any major event in the world. Yet today, he's chosen a political class at a university. This sparks a barrage of questions in everyone's mind. Why is he here? When did Shaq get interested in politics? Is he going to speak? But despite all the attention focused on him, Shaq remains calm. He sits there, hands on the desk, listening and observing. Professor Calloway smirks slightly. A thought flashes through his mind. This could be an interesting class. And then he decides to challenge this special guest. Today's class will not just be a typical political lecture. It will be a showdown. And no one in the class, not even Shaquille O'Neal, can predict what's about to unfold. The atmosphere in the lecture hall suddenly changed. The low murmurs faded away, replaced by a sense of curious anticipation. Shaquille O'Neal remained seated, his face expressionless, but his eyes scanned the room, noting every reaction, every subtle smirk from the professor, and every knowing chuckle from some of the students. At the front, Professor Richard Calloway stood with his arms crossed, his head tilted slightly to one side, his smile betraying a hint of amusement. He was the type of person who always commanded the room in his lectures. He knew how to lead the conversation, how to dominate the weaker individuals with confidence and sharp rhetoric. And today, in front of him, stood a perfect target. Calloway wasn't the type to care much for sports, but he knew exactly who Shaquille O'Neal was. A great athlete, a cultural icon, a successful businessman. But to him, Shaq was still just a public figure, someone who was celebrated for his physicality rather than his intellect. And in this academic setting, where Calloway was the one guiding every discussion, he wasn't about to let a basketball player become the center of attention without a challenge. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with provocation. "Oh, today we have a special guest." He paused for a beat, just long enough for everyone's attention in the room to shift fully to shock. It's not every day we have a sports star join us for a discussion. Perhaps you can share with us what it's like to build a career based on physical prowess rather than intellect." His words rang out slowly, deliberately stretching the final sentence to emphasize the point. The mockery in his tone was clear. He knew exactly what he was doing, setting up a confrontation, turning Shaq into a case study in his lecture. A few students chuckled, not too loudly, but enough to create an atmosphere of subtle agreement. Others, though not laughing, couldn't hide their curiosity, eager to see how Shaq would respond. But Shaq didn't flinch. He remained seated, his massive arms resting calmly on the desk, completely still. But what caught the class's attention more was his gaze. Calm, quiet, yet far from vacant. It was sharp, as if reading every detail of the situation, observing, analyzing. No one knew exactly what he was thinking, but it was clear he wasn't rattled. Professor Calloway raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Shaq's composure. "Nothing to say, Mr. O'Neill?" He pushed further, wanting Shaq to respond, wanting him to engage in the game he had set up. The room fell silent. Eyes locked onto Shaq. Some students leaned forward, as if wanting to hear more clearly what was about to happen. Shaq slowly looked directly into Professor Calloway's eyes. Then he calmly stood up. As he rose, there was a moment when the entire room seemed overshadowed by his massive presence. He wasn't in a hurry, showed no emotion, but the weight of his presence was enough to make the room feel smaller. He glanced around, his eyes briefly sweeping over every face before focusing directly on Calloway. The class held its breath. Then Shaq spoke, slowly, steadily, but with undeniable authority. "Professor Calloway, I have nothing to say, at least not in a hurry." Shaq paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. He raised an eyebrow as if considering something. "But I have a question for you." The silence in the lecture hall became absolute. Calloway raised an eyebrow, not expecting this. He thought he would be the one steering the conversation, but somehow Shaq had turned the tables. And when Shaq's next words came, they weren't just a question. They were a real challenge. The atmosphere in the classroom became heavy, a strange silence hanging in the air as Shaquille O'Neal slowly stood up. When he rose, the whole class seemed to be enveloped by a massive shadow, as if the room had just been shrunk by his overpowering presence. Every movement he made exuded absolute control. There was no rush, no haste. He was not a man caught off guard, but one who was accustomed to controlling the court, controlling the battle. And here, even though it wasn't a basketball game, it was still a confrontation that he was ready to engage in. He didn't frown, nor did he appear angry or defensive. On the contrary, his gaze was calm, sharp, as if he were evaluating the entire situation with a frightening level of composure. He glanced over each student in the class. Some lowered their eyes, avoiding his gaze, while others stared back, waiting to see what he would do next. The giggles that had filled the room earlier disappeared entirely, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation, tense like a drawn bowstring. Finally, Shaq directed his gaze toward Professor Calloway. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words, then spoke in a deep, warm, but powerful voice, each word landing with the force of a solid punch. "Professor Calloway," he began, his tone steady, unwavering, "I respect your point of view. After all, I'm here to learn, to understand more about the world. And I believe academia is truly about exchanging ideas, not imposing them." As the final words echoed, an invisible shift occurred in the space. It wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, but it was. unmistakably a turning point. The mocking tone of some students gradually faded away, and faces that had once looked smug were now more cautious. Shaq didn't just respond to Calloway's provocation. He wasn't angry, nor did he react in a way that Calloway could easily manipulate. He was steering the conversation on his own terms. Professor Calloway, though still standing at the podium, felt this shift. His smile, initially full of confidence, now carried a hint of tension. Yet he remained a master of language, someone seasoned in debate. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and challenge. "So, you think academia is about exchanging ideas?" he repeated slowly, as if weighing each word. "But how do you exchange when some people, like you, come into this game with so much power and privilege?" The words cut deep, sharp as a knife, aiming straight for the heart of the conversation. He wasn't directly mocking Shaq anymore, but instead, he was redirecting the debate toward a new angle, turning him into a symbol of power and privilege. "I don't deny that you're successful, Shaquille," Calloway continued, maintaining his controlled tone. "But think about this. Have you ever felt like you've been given more opportunities than others could ever have? Have you ever wondered whether you can truly understand the lives of those without extraordinary talents like yours?" Some students nodded in agreement. This was Calloway's usual tactic. He didn't directly criticize. He led others into difficult positions with weighty, implied questions. But Shaq remained unfazed. He didn't laugh, didn't show any sign of being cornered. Instead, he took a step back, crossed his arms over his chest as if relaxing, before locking eyes with Calloway and responding in a slow yet firm tone. "Professor Calloway, you say I have privilege. But have you ever asked yourself what privilege really is?" No one in the class expected that question. Some students raised their eyebrows. Others whispered among themselves. Calloway even paused for a moment, but only for a second before he tilted his head, offering a probing smile. "Oh? I'm listening." Shaq didn't rush to answer. He slowly scanned the room, noticing every glance, every held breath. Then he spoke, deliberately, each word echoing like the beat of a drum. "Privilege isn't being born with talent. Privilege is having the power to stand in front of a classroom, using your position to guide the conversation in whatever direction you want, and expecting no one to challenge you." The air seemed to freeze. Some students widened their eyes. A few of them had seen how Professor Calloway educated students with differing opinions. But no one had ever dared to say something like that so openly, and certainly not with the calmness Shaq had displayed. Professor Calloway still wore a smile, but there was a cold gleam in his eyes. He knew very well that the game had changed. Shaq was not someone who could be easily pressured, and now, even though this was a political science class, it had turned into a real confrontation. Professor Richard Calloway tilted his head slightly, his smile unchanged, but in his eyes a cold glint flashed. He understood that he was facing a figure who wouldn't easily be cornered, and that did not deter him. On the contrary, it made him more intrigued. He slowly folded his arms across his chest, looking thoughtful, as if carefully considering his counter-argument. But in reality, he already had his next move planned. "So, are you saying that athletic success equates to intelligence?" He elongated his words, as if emphasizing the absurdity of the point Shaq had just made. The class waited. Some students began nodding, recognizing the sharpness in the professor's question. Calloway continued, his voice still carrying an air of subtle mockery. "True progress is in academics, not muscles. A talented athlete may have extraordinary skills on the field, but that doesn't mean they can understand the complexities of politics, economics, or philosophy. After all, you can dominate a basketball game, but that doesn't mean you can lead a country or navigate complex social systems. His words rang out like a sharp blade, cutting straight to the heart of the debate. Some students in the class nodded in agreement. A few whispered among themselves, as if they had just realized a truth they hadn't considered before. Others remained silent, their eyes on Shaq, waiting to see how he would respond. But Shaq didn't flinch. He stood there, solid as a giant statue, his gaze showing no signs of confusion or defensiveness. On the contrary, in his eyes, there was something, a calmness, an understanding that perhaps no one in the room had expected from an athlete. He slowly took a deep breath and then answered, each word spoken with quiet confidence. "Professor, intelligence isn't just in books. It's also in experience, in perseverance, and in the ability to apply knowledge in real life." Shaq paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink into the silent space of the classroom. "I'm not standing here to say that an athlete can be a better politician than a scholar, but I want to ask you something in return. When did academic knowledge become the only thing of value? When did life experience, the ability to read people, leadership, and perseverance in the face of challenges become unworthy of respect?" The room was silent. The students who had previously nodded in agreement with the professor were now reconsidering. Shaq's question was not just a counter-argument, it was a game-changing move. Professor Calloway recognized that, but he was not someone easily pushed into a corner. He raised an eyebrow as though deeply considering his response, then replied in a tone that still carried a challenge. "I'm not denying the value of life experience, Shaquille. But the problem is, your experience comes from a very different world. A world of fame, multi-million-dollar contracts, and power that most people will never have. So, how can you claim to understand ordinary people? How can you compare your experience to that of those who struggle every day just to make a living?" A few students nodded more forcefully. Calloway was playing a very dangerous card. He was positioning Shaq as someone of privilege, turning him from a person with real-world experience into someone who, in his view, could not understand the struggles of the working class or the disadvantaged in society. Shaq looked him straight in the eye. Not angry, not provoked. He simply exhaled slowly, then responded gently but firmly, "Professor, if you think I was born with all those privileges, you're mistaken." The class was shaken. A few students widened their eyes. Those who had previously agreed with the professor were now waiting to hear what Shaq would say next. He continued, his voice not loud but carrying more weight than any sound in the room. "I grew up in a poor neighborhood in Newark. I saw violence, I saw discrimination, I saw kids who would never have a chance to step foot in a classroom like this. When I talk about experience, I'm not talking about money or fame. I'm talking about perseverance, about how a person can overcome the toughest circumstances to become who they want to be." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the class. Some students lowered their eyes as if reflecting on something. Shaq continued, his voice now deeper but full of emotion. "You ask me if I can understand ordinary people? I am one of them, and I never forget that." No one in the class could say anything in that moment. Even Professor Calloway fell silent for a moment. He hadn't expected Shaq to respond this way, not only rebutting his point, but also striking at the heart of what he had just said. But Calloway was not one to back down easily. He tilted his head, his tone no longer mocking but sharper. "You say you understand struggle, the challenges people face. But let's be realistic, Shaquille. Do you really understand what this society's going through? Or are you just speaking from the perspective of someone who has been at the top for too long?" The class held its breath. Shaq remained unshaken. He stared directly at Professor Calloway, his gaze full of power. And then he slowly took a step forward, a slow but sure movement, carrying an overwhelming presence. At that moment, the debate was no longer just a verbal sparring match. It had become a real battle. The atmosphere in the lecture hall seemed to thicken, tense and heavy. Shaquille O'Neal was no longer just an athlete standing in the classroom. He was now the center of attention, someone everyone was focused on, not for his fame or towering height, but because what he was about to say could completely alter the course of the debate. He wasn't in a hurry. He let the atmosphere settle a bit, allowing each student in the room to feel the importance of this moment. Then he spoke, his deep voice carrying a weight that made every word resonate in the minds of those listening. "I grew up in a poor neighborhood. Not everyone knew this. Most people only saw Shaquille O'Neal as the glamorous figure on the court, a successful businessman, a celebrity in the entertainment world. But they didn't know about the young Shaquille, who had to walk through streets filled with violence, where surviving each day was a stroke of luck." He continued without exaggeration, without complaints, simply the truth. "My mom always taught me that education was the key to changing my life. So, alongside basketball, I studied. I did business. I earned a PhD, not to prove anything, but because I believe in the value of knowledge." He paused for a moment, watching the reactions of the class. For the first time, no one laughed. There were no whispers or mocking glances. Instead, some students began to look at him differently. Not as a sports star, but as someone who had fought to overcome adversity. Someone who had chosen the path of learning instead of relying solely on his fame. Professor Calloway was silent for a moment. He hadn't expected this. In his mind, Shaq was a person of fame, of physical power. But what he had just heard was not the story of a mere athlete. It was the story of a man who had risen on his own, not just through muscle but through intellect, willpower, and perseverance. But Calloway was not someone who easily let himself be steered away from the course he had grown accustomed to controlling. He tilted his head slightly, his voice becoming sharper, like a thin blade slicing through the already tense air. "All of that is admirable, Shaquille. But let's be honest. Do you think your journey is truly the same as the journey of ordinary people?" The class fell silent again. This was Calloway, always knowing how to turn the debate in his favor. He continued, his eyes gleaming with a probing look, as if wanting to expose something. "I don't deny that you worked hard. But think about it. How many people could have the same opportunity as you? How many people could be 7 feet 1 inch, could have extraordinary athletic talent, could be accepted into the NBA and earn millions of dollars?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air, creating the effect he wanted: doubt, hesitation. Some students nodded. Others remained silent, but it was clear they were thinking about what the professor had just said. Calloway recognized the moment, and he pushed the conversation further. "I'm not denying your efforts, Shaquille. But I want you to imagine, if you didn't have that height, didn't have that talent, didn't have the doors opened by sports, would you have achieved what you have today? Or would you just be another one of the millions left behind by society?" This was no longer just a question. It was a direct attack. It wasn't just aimed at Shaq, but at the story he had just shared. Calloway didn't want to dismiss Shaq's efforts, but he wanted to paint a picture that Shaq's success couldn't be separated from the external factors that gave him an advantage over others. The class was in a state of anticipation. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence. All eyes were on Shaq. But Shaq didn't back down. He looked directly at Calloway, his gaze unwavering. And then he spoke, not quickly, not loudly, but each word carrying the weight of concrete blocks hitting the floor. "Professor, if you think my success comes only from my physicality, then you've missed the whole story." That sentence was like a hammer striking the middle of the classroom. Shaq wasn't letting Calloway control this debate. He was taking back the initiative. He took a step forward, looking at the class, and continued. "I don't deny that I had an advantage. But ask yourself, how many people have advantages and do nothing with them? How many young, talented athletes have lost opportunities because they lacked discipline, because they didn't have the right mindset, because they didn't understand the value of education?" Shaq swept his eyes across the classroom, his voice deep but resonant. "I didn't succeed just because I'm tall. I succeeded because I studied, worked tirelessly, set goals, and pursued them with everything I had. If you say I'm privileged because I'm tall, then isn't someone with a Harvard degree also privileged? We all have different advantages and disadvantages. The question is, what do we do with them?" The class fell into silence. Professor Calloway, who always knew how to control the crowd, now looked like he didn't have full control over the situation. Shaq wasn't just refuting. He was turning the question back on the class. And, for the first time, the students who had once supported Calloway began questioning themselves. Shaq had just turned this debate into something bigger than both of them. And Calloway knew he couldn't back down at this moment. The atmosphere in the lecture hall grew tenser by the moment, like a stretched-out guitar string about to snap. The students, who had initially been eager to witness the confrontation, now sat still, their eyes fixed on the two main figures. No more whispers, no more quiet laughter, only the absolute silence of a class that had shifted from a political lecture to a heated debate. Professor Calloway crossed his arms, the mocking smile gone, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. Shaq had caught him off guard, steering the conversation away from what he had expected. But Calloway was not the type of person to easily let a student, even a sports legend, take control. He took a slow breath, then continued, his voice lower, yet no less provocative. "But the reality is, you're representing a privileged class." The words struck like a sharp knife. A few students raised their eyebrows. Others glanced at Shaq, waiting for his reaction. Calloway went on, his voice slow, as if guiding Shaq into an invisible trap. "People like you, those with power, money, and influence, they don't see the world the way ordinary people do. You talk about hard work, persistence, overcoming adversity, but how many people out there have the opportunity to do that? How many people can go to school without worrying about financial burdens? How many people can live without fear of what tomorrow will bring?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air, creating a moment of wait. Then he continued, his voice sharper. "Shaquille, I'm not denying that you've worked hard, but let's be honest. Do you really understand politics the way scholars like us do? People who've dedicated their lives to studying, reading thousands of pages, analyzing every detail of history, economics, and philosophy. Or are you simply a famous person trying to step into a discussion you're not? Ready for? A few students nodded. This was what they had thought from the beginning of this debate. Shaquille O'Neal might be a basketball legend, but did that make him qualified to argue with a political professor? Once again, all eyes turned to Shaq, but Shaq didn't waver. There was no sign of anger on his face, no raised eyebrow, no smirk, no look of confusion. He was in complete control of his emotions. And then he took a step forward. Just one step, but it was enough to change the atmosphere in the room. No longer was Shaquille O'Neal sitting quietly like a student. This was a Shaquille O'Neal commanding the space, owning the moment. He looked directly at Calloway, his gaze neither hostile nor defensive. It was simply certain, a quiet confidence, an understanding that didn't need to be shouted. Then, with a low, clear, and deliberate voice, he responded, "Professor Calloway, you say I represent a privileged class, but let me say one thing. I've never forgotten where I came from, and I've never let success blind me to what I've been through. I've seen my friends grow up without the opportunities I had. I've watched my family struggle in life, not because they weren't working hard, but because they didn't have a path to follow. I understand the hardships that ordinary people face because I've been there. I used to be one of them." Shaq paused, letting his words settle into the stillness of the room. A few students no longer looked at Calloway with complete support. For the first time, they began to wonder, did they really understand Shaquille O'Neal? Or were they just like Calloway, seeing him through a lens full of bias? Shaq continued, this time his voice stronger. "And as for academics, I don't deny the value of books, of research. I respect those who have dedicated their lives to studying politics, economics, history. But wisdom doesn't just come from reading books. It comes from living, from facing real hardships, from standing up after failure and learning from those very setbacks." He scanned the room, his eyes meeting each person's gaze, making them feel the weight of his words. "So, let me ask you this. Do people like you, those who have spent their whole lives in university lecture halls, truly understand the lives of those out there? The ones who have nothing but their bare hands? The ones who don't have the chance to sit in this classroom?" No one in the room had expected that question. Some students raised their eyebrows, others whispered to each other. Calloway faltered for a moment. Shaq wasn't just refuting, he was turning the question back on Calloway, putting him in the position of the one who needed to prove himself. And, for the first time in this debate, Calloway realized that he no longer had complete control of the situation. He furrowed his brow, but still maintained a stiff smile. But Shaq didn't stop. He took another step, this time not just towards Calloway, but towards the entire class, and with a slow, assured voice, he left a question that no one could ignore. "So, tell me, Professor, what truly makes someone wise? The books on the shelf, or the lessons learned from life itself?" That question wasn't just for Calloway, it was for everyone sitting in that room. The atmosphere in the lecture hall at that moment was tense, as taut as a violin string. The students who had been smiling just moments ago while hearing Professor Calloway attack Shaq were now sitting still, completely drawn into the debate. No one saw Shaq as just an athlete stepping into a field that didn't belong to him anymore. He wasn't just standing his ground against Calloway's challenge, he was fighting back. "Professor, you said I'm privileged," Shaq said, his voice low and firm, each word like a hammer hitting the classroom floor. "But do you know how many hours I had to work to achieve success?" He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Calloway's, with no sign of hesitation or doubt. "Do you know how much I've invested in education? How many students I've helped get the chance to learn?" For the first time in this debate, Calloway didn't respond immediately. Shaq didn't wait for an answer. He continued, his voice deepening but carrying a weight that no one could ignore. "I've worked tirelessly to get what I have today. I've trained from dawn till dusk while my friends slept or had fun. I've never stopped learning, not just about basketball, but about business, finance, and how one can control their own destiny." He paused, taking a deep breath. Then his voice lowered, yet carried a profound empathy, no longer just a rebuttal, but a statement of his belief in life and people. Politics isn't just about theories in textbooks. Politics is about people, about how we create real change. A small ripple spread through the classroom. Some students exchanged glances, some nodded gently, while others waited to see what Calloway would do next. But Calloway wasn't so easily pushed back. He tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes as if reassessing his opponent. Someone like him couldn't let Shaq gain the upper hand. He couldn't allow an athlete, a rookie outsider, to step into his classroom and flip the tables. With a thin but sharp smile, he spoke, maintaining his calm composure. "Shaquille, no one denies that you've worked hard. But let's face the truth. What you said about politics being about people sounds good, but it doesn't reflect reality. Politics is a complex game where power, systems, and ideologies collide. It's not just about doing the right thing or helping a few students." He crossed his arms, leaning slightly forward, his voice growing sharper as he attacked directly what Shaq had just said. "You can invest in education. You can help others. That's commendable. But let's be real. Do you understand the systems you face? The powers controlling politics? Do you really know how a government operates? How major decisions are made? How politics is not always about doing the right thing, but sometimes about choosing between the lesser evils?" Some students nodded. This was a subtle counterattack from Calloway. He wasn't outright dismissing Shaq. He was diminishing the value of what Shaq had just said, placing him as someone naive about politics. One can succeed in sports, in business, but that doesn't mean they understand what goes on in the boardroom, in parliament, in international negotiations. One can have a good heart, but that doesn't make them a good leader. He stared at Shaq as if waiting to see how he would react. And in that moment, Shaq smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile. It wasn't a smug smile. It was a knowing smile. He slowly nodded, as if confirming something he had anticipated. Then he spoke, his tone steady, slow, but stronger than ever. "Professor, you just said that politics isn't about doing the right thing, but about power, systems, and things only those on the inside understand. But isn't that the problem?" A few students straightened up, completely drawn into what Shaq was saying. It's those on the inside, the ones who say politics isn't simple. It's them who've created a system where the people no longer trust their leaders. It's them who've made people like me, those who come from reality, who understand life more than any politician, feel disrespected, excluded from the debate. He paused briefly, locking eyes with Calloway. "And that's why I'm here today. Not to debate with you, but to ask a question that you're too afraid to answer." Calloway narrowed his eyes, his gaze sharper, but he said nothing. Shaq took a deep breath, then asked, "If politics isn't about doing the right thing, then why do we let it continue this way?" The classroom fell silent. No one laughed. No one spoke. And for the first time during the entire debate, Calloway didn't have an immediate answer. The atmosphere in the lecture hall was no longer the same as it had been at the beginning of the class. The weight in the air was palpable, and there were no more stifled laughs or raised eyebrows in mockery. The students, who had initially been eager to watch Shaquille O'Neal get taken down by Professor Calloway, now sat in silence, their eyes sparkling with an indescribable change. They had begun to listen. They weren't just hearing what Shaq was saying. They were thinking about it. They were looking at the classroom, at the people around them, at their own place in society. Some students, those who had previously agreed with Calloway, now felt a sense of unease. They couldn't deny that Shaq's argument carried weight. He wasn't just rebutting the professor. He was making a strong accusation about the very nature of the political system that Calloway was defending. Those who had once seen Shaq only as a basketball player were no longer so sure of that. He wasn't like those celebrities who just spoke for the sake of speaking. He wasn't like those who exploited their fame to intrude into conversations they didn't fully understand. He knew exactly what he was saying, and he was making them reconsider. Up front, Calloway recognized this too. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. He could see the students' gaze no longer directed at him with the same uncritical admiration. Some of those who had agreed with him were now hesitating. Others, who had always remained silent, now tilted their heads, their eyes reflecting a new light. And that was something Calloway could not let happen. He had been teaching this subject for too long, too accustomed to standing at the highest point in the classroom. He was not used to being challenged. He took a deep breath, trying to regain the upper hand. Shaquille, what you're saying sounds very nice, very inspiring, but the issue here isn't emotion, it's reality. You say politics should be about doing the right thing, but let me ask you, who decides what's right? You, a basketball player, someone who has never been involved in real politics, never made a decision that affects millions of people? You can say that the current political system has problems, but that doesn't mean people like you could do better. The classroom fell silent again. Some students, who had been convinced by Shaq earlier, now had second thoughts. Shaq didn't react immediately. He let Calloway's words sink in. He wasn't in a rush to respond, not jumping into a hasty rebuttal. He simply stood there, his expression calm but sharper than before. Then, after a moment, he took a step forward. "Professor, you asked who decides what's right?" He emphasized each word, his voice not loud but resonating throughout the room. The answer is simple. The people, the ones out there living in this system, whose lives are impacted every day by political decisions. Shaq looked around the room, his eyes sweeping across each student. Not the politicians, not the scholars, not the ones sitting in closed-door meetings, making decisions they'll never have to face the consequences of. He turned to look directly at Calloway. "You ask me if I could do better? I'm not saying I could, but I do know one thing. There are a lot of people out there who could do better than the ones in power right now. But they'll never get the chance, because people like you tell them they're not smart enough, not educated enough, not politically aware enough to participate. And I'll ask you again, then who does politics really represent?" This time, no one nodded at Professor Calloway. No one laughed or whispered to each other. They simply sat there in silence, thinking. And Calloway knew he had lost something important: control. For the first time, he wasn't sure he was winning. Professor Calloway realized that he was gradually losing control. There was no doubt. Shaquille O'Neal, whom he had once thought would be easily defeated in this debate, had not only held his ground, but also turned the tide. He sensed a shift in the classroom atmosphere, saw the students' gazes no longer directed at him with absolute trust as before. He could not let this continue. Calloway clenched his hand slightly, as if trying to keep calm. He knew he needed to hit harder to regain his position. If he let Shaq continue to lead the debate, everything would be lost. He took a deep breath and raised his voice, intentionally louder than before, as if trying to draw the attention back to himself. You may have success, Shaquille. No one denies that. But the issue is, what you represent is nothing more than nostalgia for the past. The conservative ideas you support only want to hold on to old values, unwilling to progress. You talk about responsibility, gratitude, perseverance. But have you ever thought that these very values might be stifling progress? That if we cling to the past, we'll never move forward? Some students listened intently. Others nodded slowly. Calloway saw this, and he knew there was still a chance to turn the tide. But, just as he thought he could change the situation, Shaq smiled. It wasn't a smug smile, nor a mocking one. It was the smile of someone who had seen through his opponent's moves, someone who had known this very question would arise. Shaq nodded slightly, then slowly spoke, calm but with weight. Professor, when did responsibility, gratitude, and perseverance become outdated values? The space in the classroom seemed to freeze. The students who had nodded to Calloway earlier now hesitated, beginning to reconsider what had just been said. Shaq continued, each word ringing with certainty, not rushed but powerful. You say I represent conservative thinking, that I want to preserve old values. But some values never go out of style, Professor, not because they belong to the past, but because they are the foundation for any society that wishes to progress. Responsibility is never outdated. If we don't teach our children responsibility, who will be accountable for the future? Gratitude is never outdated. If we don't remember what got us to where we are today, how can we build a better tomorrow? Perseverance is never outdated. If we give up at the first sign of difficulty, how can we make any progress? Shaq looked around the classroom at each student, then slowly turned back to Calloway. You say I'm holding on to the past, but what I'm protecting is not the past. It's what has helped us get to where we are today. And if we lose those things, then any progress we make will have no solid foundation. Silence filled the classroom. Some students exchanged glances as if they had just realized something they had never considered before. Calloway could feel it, and he knew he was in a difficult position. He had used all the tactics he was familiar with: sarcasm, dismissal, intellectual challenge. But none of them could shake Shaq. And worse for him, Shaq wasn't just defending, he was taking control. For the first time throughout the debate, Calloway felt like he was the one who had to prove something, not Shaq. But he couldn't let that continue. He clenched his hand, trying to hide the brief flicker of confusion on his face. Then he spoke, this time with more urgency. So, tell me, Shaquille, if the values you mention are never outdated, why does the world still change? Why are old ideas replaced? If all we need is responsibility, gratitude, and perseverance, why are the old systems no longer adequate? Why can't we continue as we were? Some students nodded. Calloway had thrown out another question, one designed to undermine Shaq's argument. But Shaq did not waver. He took a slow breath, then answered, his voice even stronger than before. Professor, The world changes not because its foundations must be torn down. We can innovate technology, change how we work, adjust policies, but people still need responsibility. People still need gratitude, and people still need perseverance. Shaq took another step forward, his voice lower but full of power. The world doesn't change because we abandon those values. The world changes because we use those values to build something better. Silence overtook the classroom once again, but this time it wasn't just the silence of a tense debate. It was the silence of realization, of awakening. And Calloway knew that he no longer held control over the room. Shaquille O'Neal stood in the middle of the lecture hall, facing Professor Calloway, the man who had always controlled every discussion, the one students were used to listening to and agreeing with. But today, for the first time, everything had changed. Shaq didn't rush to speak. He slowly scanned the room with his eyes. The silence in the room was no longer just a pause. It was a sign of something shifting. The students who had previously mocked and ridiculed him for daring to argue with a seasoned scholar were now completely silent. Those who had seen him only as an athlete, an outsider unworthy of being part of this dialogue, were now looking at him in a different light. And then he spoke, slowly, confidently, without a hint of hesitation. "I haven't insulted the professor. I haven't criticized anyone." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink into the air. "But since I entered this class, I have been mocked, belittled. So who is truly unwilling to accept differing opinions?" A few students sat up straight. Others glanced at each other. They realized Shaq wasn't wrong. From the moment he walked into the room, Professor Calloway had attacked him, immediately putting him on the defensive simply because he didn't belong to the academic world. Calloway hadn't debated him with respect but with sarcasm, trying to make him seem inferior in front of the class. But Shaq wasn't fazed. He didn't get riled up. He didn't let the mockery affect his tone. And now he had made everyone ask an important question: whether those who always spoke of openness and progress truly accepted differing viewpoints. Professor Calloway clenched his fists, his eyes flashing with a cold glint. He knew he was losing control, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. Calloway took a deep breath and smiled, a sharp smile, but one that held a hint of tension. "Shaquille, I won't deny that you make a good argument, but don't pretend that the conservative side you represent actually respects differing opinions. People like you always talk about free speech, but they're the first ones to want to control how others think, censor history, and erase progressive ideas. You say you've been mocked? But people like me, those who dare to stand up for change, are attacked just as much. So, who is really being silenced here?" Calloway had thrown a dangerous counterpunch. He knew that if there was one thing Shaq couldn't control, it was the nature of politics. He wasn't focused on Shaq as an individual anymore. He had raised the debate to a new level. Now, this was no longer a confrontation between a professor and an athlete. It had become a battle of ideas, a clash of political ideologies. Some students started nodding at the professor. They realized the debate was no longer just about Shaq. It was touching on bigger issues, the ideological wars society was facing. But once again, Shaq remained unshaken. He gave a slight nod as though he had expected this. "Professor, I'm not here to represent any political party. I'm not standing here to debate like a politician. I'm standing here as a citizen, as a person who's lived through adversity, who's had to fight for the chance to speak my mind. But what I see clearly is this: you're not debating me to seek the truth. You're debating to win." Shaq took a step forward, his eyes shining with determination. "I've never mocked anyone in this debate, but from the beginning, I've been put on the defensive. Why? Because I'm not an academic? Because I don't belong to the world you call intellectual?" He paused, his gaze sweeping over the classroom. If those who have the power to teach, who have the power to shape students' thinking, use that power to impose their personal viewpoints, then who is really controlling thought here? No one said a word. The students who had once supported the professor were now thinking more deeply. Some of them looked down, as if trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Shaq continued, his voice low but powerful. "Academia is not about making everyone think the same. It's about exchange, about accepting differing viewpoints and learning from them." He turned to look at Calloway, his eyes not filled with hostility, only resolve. "But instead of listening to me as a person, you chose to mock me from the start. So, who's really trying to control thought?" That question wasn't just aimed at Calloway, it was aimed at everyone in the room. A prolonged silence followed, and for the first time, Calloway had no immediate response. A whispering wave spread across the classroom. The murmurs began faintly, then grew louder as students turned to one another, exchanging glances. Something had changed. For the first time since the debate began, there was a clear shift in the class's perception. Students who had once placed their absolute trust in Professor Calloway, who had nodded in agreement with every word he said, were no longer so certain. They began to ask questions they had never considered before. Was Shaq really wrong? Or had they been the ones unwilling to listen all along? They recalled how the debate had started. Shaq had never attacked anyone, never made personal attacks, never mocked anyone. But Professor Calloway was different. From the start, Calloway had used a sarcastic tone, putting Shaq on the defensive, not giving him a fair opportunity to voice his thoughts. And now, with Shaq proving that he could stand firm, with undeniable arguments, Calloway was attempting to redirect the debate, turning it into a battle over political ideology rather than focusing on the most important issue: freedom of thought. Who was really trying to control the thinking in this room? Who was the one truly unwilling to accept differing opinions? These questions began to surface in each student's mind, and Calloway knew it. At the front of the classroom, Professor Calloway clenched his hands tightly. He didn't like this silence. He didn't like the feeling of losing control. Throughout his teaching career, he had always had the last word. He was the one who decided the direction of every debate. But today, that was no longer the case. He could see it in the eyes of the students. They no longer looked at him with unwavering trust, and that made him feel a restlessness he didn't want to admit. But he couldn't let Shaq win. Calloway took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He still had a chance to regain control. He knew that if he showed any sign of insecurity, if he revealed even the slightest hint of defensiveness, he would have truly lost. So he did what he knew best. He launched another counterattack. He leaned back, crossed his arms in front of his chest, and tried to regain his usual calm demeanor. "Shaquille," he began, his voice slower this time, as if trying to control every word. "I will admit that you have made some good arguments, but there's one thing you haven't answered." Shaq stood firm, showing no surprise. He simply nodded, signaling Calloway to continue. "You talk about freedom of thought, about respecting differing views. But can you honestly say that people like you, people with influence, with fame, truly allow everyone to have an equal opportunity to speak?" Calloway paused, letting his words sink in. You say I'm trying to control the debate, but look at the world outside. Those with the most power, the loudest voices, aren't professors like me. It's people like you, those with millions of followers, those who can speak a single sentence and the whole world listens. So, let's be honest. Do you really want a fair debate? Or do you just want to make sure your voice is always the final one? The class fell silent once again. Calloway knew this was his last card, questioning Shaq's legitimacy. If he could make the students believe that Shaq was just a fraud, that he too was part of the system he was criticizing, perhaps he could win back the class's support. Some students nodded. They could see the logic in this argument, but Shaq didn't flinch. He had anticipated this, and he was ready. He took a deep breath, then spoke, this time more slowly but with greater authority. Professor, I never said that I am the only one entitled to speak. He paused, his eyes scanning the classroom, looking at each student. I'm not standing here to make anyone agree with me. I'm not standing here to impose my thoughts on anyone. I'm standing here to prove that everyone deserves a voice. He turned back to face Calloway, his eyes filled with challenge but not hostility. But if, even in a classroom where freedom of thought should be most respected, I can't speak without being ridiculed, how can we expect that people out there, those without the fame I have, will ever have a chance to speak? He paused again, then spoke more forcefully than ever before. I'm not standing here to win. I'm standing here to ask the questions we all need to think about. He turned to look at the class. Who is really controlling this debate? Who is truly unwilling to hear opposing views? And most importantly, who among us is really ready to listen? The classroom was completely silent. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence. But in their eyes, Shaq could see that he had struck something deeper. They no longer saw him just as an athlete. They were seeing him as someone who had made them question how they were perceiving the world. And for the first time, Calloway was no longer sure he would win this debate. Professor Calloway opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his teaching career, he couldn't come up with an immediate rebuttal. It wasn't that he didn't have arguments, but whatever he said now could backfire. Every tactic he had used before, sarcasm, dismissal, challenge, was ineffective against Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq wasn't just defending. He was steering the debate to a place where Calloway had lost control. And worse, the entire class had noticed it. The students who had laughed when Shaq was attacked were now completely silent. Some stared at their desks, some looked at Calloway, but most of them were gazing at Shaq, as if waiting for him to provide the real answer in the room. Shaq didn't miss the moment. He didn't attack Calloway, nor did he use the professor's silence to bring him down in front of the class. He simply kept talking. I didn't come here to argue. I came to learn. But I realize that even in a class about politics, there are still people unwilling to accept differences. He paused for a moment, letting his words float into the quiet space of the lecture hall. He looked around the room, his eyes no longer speaking only to Calloway. They were speaking to everyone in the room. We always talk about freedom of speech, about openness, about accepting differing views. But what happens when someone expresses an opinion that doesn't fit what we want to hear? He leaned slightly forward, his voice lower but full of power. They're ridiculed. They're belittled. They're forced to prove they have the right to speak. He stretched out his hand, as if pointing to something invisible but clearly before them. I'm not talking about myself. I don't need anyone to agree with me. But I want all of us to ask ourselves, how many people out there have never had the chance to speak up? How many people are too afraid to share their views because they fear being mocked, dismissed, seen as inferior before they even get a chance to say a word? A noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The students began to feel the discomfort of how they had behaved at the start of the class. They remembered the laughs when Shaq walked in. They remembered how they had been waiting for Calloway to take him down, as if this were some kind of entertainment rather than a serious discussion. But now, they weren't so sure they had been right. Calloway saw it. He looked around the room, seeing faces that were once full of confidence now filled with thought. Some students who had supported him before no longer looked at him the same way. That made Calloway feel a worry he had never experienced before. But he couldn't let it continue. He needed to regain control. He exhaled deeply and said, this time his voice wasn't as sharp as before, but there was a slight sense of urgency, defensiveness. Shaquille, you're speaking as if I'm the one who doesn't want to hear differing opinions. But the truth is, in this class, I've given you the opportunity to speak. I haven't stopped you. I've allowed you to challenge me, to confront me. He scanned the room, searching for agreement from the students. Some nodded, but others remained silent, no longer sure. Calloway continued, this time trying to steer the debate to a place where he could regain control. And I'll say this. Freedom of speech doesn't mean all opinions are correct. Not everyone is qualified to engage in every debate. You can have an opinion, but that doesn't mean it holds the same value as those who have spent their lives studying a subject. Some students nodded. It was a reasonable argument. Not all opinions have equal weight. Calloway thought he had found a way out, but Shaq wouldn't let that happen. He nodded slowly, as if agreeing with Calloway's point. But then, he countered with a simple question that was enough to shake Calloway's entire argument. Then, Professor, who decides which opinions have value? The class held its breath. Shaq didn't wait for Calloway to answer. He continued, his voice deeper but stronger than ever. If only people in academia have the right to participate in debates, does that mean people without degrees should never have a voice? If only those with credentials are allowed to share their opinions, how can we be sure that the truth isn't controlled by a small group of people? He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room once more. Is that really what we want? A society where only a small group decides what's right, who gets to speak, and who doesn't. The room was completely silent, and for the first time, Calloway couldn't hide the confusion in his eyes. He knew that if he answered yes, he would admit that the system he defended wasn't truly democratic, wasn't truly open. But if he answered no, he would have to acknowledge that Shaq was right, that everyone deserves a voice. Calloway realized he had been cornered. Shaquille O'Neal, the person he thought would be easily defeated in this debate, had completely turned the tables. And, worst of all for Calloway, the entire class had realized it. The atmosphere in the lecture hall was thick with silence. It wasn't the silence of those merely listening. It was the silence of those who were realizing something. A new awareness was forming, a shift in thinking that even they could not deny. Then, suddenly, in the midst of this tense atmosphere, a student clapped. One single clap. The sound echoed throughout the room, shattering the heavy silence. Shaq still stood there, unmoved, without any sense of arrogance. He simply stared ahead, his eyes calm. He didn't need anyone to cheer for him, but clearly something had happened. Then another student clapped, then another, and within seconds the entire class was applauding. At first, the clapping was scattered, as if they were still struggling with their own thoughts, but soon the sound grew louder, stronger, spreading like a wave across the room. Professor Calloway stood there, his face tense. He said nothing, showed no emotion, but the rigidity in his gaze spoke volumes. He had lost, not because he lacked an argument, not because Shaq had won in the traditional sense, but because Calloway had lost control of the class, something he had maintained for so long. For the first time, the students no longer blindly accepted his words. They had stopped to think. They had challenged the way they saw things. And that was something Calloway never anticipated. Shaq did not smile in victory. He did not gloat. He simply stood there quietly, allowing the applause to unfold without interrupting it. Because this wasn't his victory. This was the victory of thought. The victory of a class where, for the first time, students didn't just listen, but thought for themselves. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each student. Not everyone was clapping. Some remained neutral. Some were still wrestling with their own thoughts. But what mattered was they had listened. They were no longer passive recipients of information. They had genuinely questioned, and to Shaq, that was a great achievement. Calloway took a deep breath. He looked at the class, seeing faces he had once controlled completely, now looking different. The applause gradually subsided, but its echo lingered. He knew that whatever he said next, he could not change what had happened. But, as an experienced person, he understood that this was not the time to continue debating. So, he simply nodded, turned away, and walked to the board. No congratulations for Shaq, no acknowledgement, just a simple gesture, returning to the lecture as though nothing had happened. But everyone in the class knew something had changed, and even Calloway knew it. Shaq took a deep breath. He did not turn to look at Calloway. He didn't need him to acknowledge anything, because the real victory wasn't in this debate. The real victory was the moment the people in this room began to think with their own minds. That was what Shaq had truly achieved. Shaquille O'Neal didn't smile triumphantly. He didn't need to. No smug smirk, no arrogant gaze toward Professor Calloway. He didn't need to win that way. Instead, he silently nodded, a small gesture but enough to show that he wasn't satisfied because he won the debate, but because he had done what he came here to do, make people think. He bent down slowly to pack his things. Not a single person in the class took their eyes off him. Not a single word was spoken to break the atmosphere that had been created. Even Professor Calloway, who still stood there with a face that no longer had the arrogance it once held, could only watch him, saying nothing. There was no need for anyone to announce the result. Everyone in the room knew that Shaq had accomplished something unexpected. He didn't just defend his point of view, but he had overturned the entire system of thought that had been present in this class for so long. He had defeated a seasoned professor without raising his voice, without resorting to insults, without any flowery rhetoric. He only needed the truth. Shaq stood up straight and slung his bag over his shoulder. He scanned the classroom one last time. His gaze wasn't just for those who had applauded him, but also for the students still confused, those who hadn't yet decided where they truly stood, because Shaq hadn't come here looking for praise. He had come here to plant a seed of independent thinking, of questioning, of daring to stand up against what seemed predetermined. And he knew that once that seed was planted in their minds, it would continue to grow. Whether they agreed with him or not, they would never see things the same way again. Shaq turned and walked out. His steps were heavy but firm, echoing through the room. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to hurry, because this confrontation was over. Because he wasn't just walking out of the classroom. He was walking out with a victory no one could erase. When the classroom door closed behind him, something lingered in the air, not fading away. A lesson, a change. That day, the students didn't just learn about politics. They learned about perseverance, respect, and how a person could defeat prejudice with intelligence and dignity. They witnessed how someone who had been underestimated from the start could completely turn the tables through calm and solid reasoning. They saw that the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. They understood that true power doesn't lie in authority, fame, or status. It lies in confidence, patience, and the courage to defend what one believes is right, and that lesson would stay with them forever. At the front of the classroom, Professor Calloway still stood there, his eyes fixed on the door where Shaq had just exited. He knew this wasn't just another debate. Shaquille O'Neal hadn't just challenged him, he had made him question himself, and even though Calloway might never admit it, he knew that he would never teach the same way again. Because, just like his students, he had been forced to rethink, and that was Shaq's greatest victory. And that's the story of Shaquille O'Neal, a confrontation that wasn't just a debate between an athlete and a professor, but a battle of thought, of perseverance, and of the courage to defend one's viewpoint. Shaq didn't win because he was bigger, more famous, or had a stronger reputation. He won because he never let anyone define his worth. He proved that intellect doesn't belong only to those with degrees, but to those who dare to think, dare to ask questions, and dare to speak up. But the question is, if you were one of the students in that classroom that day, where would you stand? Would you continue to believe in what you were taught, or would you dare to think for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more exciting content. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.